Thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to present Gemma Cirac-Claveras. She is a researcher at the Institut d'Història de la Ciència here at the Autonomous University, Barcelona, and her research explores the history of Earth satellite observation technologies. And in particular, she focuses on the history of the wide range of techniques and knowledge, institutions, partners, ideas involved in the production, distribution, and use of satellite data, and also their environmental, social, and political implications. She got her physics degree at the University of Barcelona and her doctoral degree at the L'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. And she's been working at several institutions all over France and the United States, and until now she's based here in Catalonia. She has received awards by NASA, by ESA, and she recently obtained an ERC starting grant. So Gemma, thanks a lot for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you to you, Alba and Christina, for inviting me here. As I was saying to Alba, I'm very happy to be here, but also a bit intimidated by such an audience like you. So I hope this talk will be somehow inspiring to someone in the room, and at least we will have the chance to have a conversation at the end. So what you're seeing here, as you know, is a hurricane seen from a satellite. And we are all familiar, or you are all familiar with these sorts of images. And our current understanding of what the environment is and what the environmental changes are today is enormously relies enormously on these sorts of images. But what are the origins of this relationship between satellite data and the environment, and when, why, and how was it articulated? On what infrastructures did it happen, and what were its political, social, and epistemic implications? Many of those persist today. So what kind of environment speaks through this data? So my aim today is to share some thoughts about what happens when we put satellite data into historical consideration. So first, I will refer to what I tentatively call the digital environment. This is a very provisory conceptual frame, a bit provocative. Then I will give some theoretical and empirical context to justify it. And then I will present the ERC research project that deals with all these kind of questions. So my provocation begins with claiming that what we understand as the environment today can be conceptualized as something I like to call digital environment. It refers to the idea that our experience of what environment is would not exist without data. And in the era of computing, or of ubiquitous computing, these are digital data. So data are a key element that underpins this idea of the digital environment, a belief in data, almost in an ideological sense. Probably you've heard about the dataism, a belief which goes beyond this little story of ours today and embraces all society. The idea that data have value by themselves, right? So the digital environment assumes a self-evident relationship between data and the environment, to the extent that data about the environment can be confused with the physical environment itself. They can be taken as synonymous, especially for policy purposes. So the digital environment can overlap and can influence the physical environment. Think that any decision today must look at past digital data to frame the future physical environment. Another feature of this digital environment is that it is oriented toward governability. So it has an implicit perspective of planetary management, how to solve the problem of how to live on Earth today, but also in the future. And prediction is central to this idea of the digital environment. And here, the underlying assumption is the environment can be predicted, thus it can be quantified, thus predicted, and thus managed. And this emphasis on prediction is very important because it assumes, or it requires a very specific methodology, the use of numerical modeling. So we must produce data that suits numerical modeling, that can be used for numerical modeling. So here there is a book that deals, I recommend you because it deals with the relationship between data and numerical modeling in the climate particular case. So yeah, this idea of the digital environment takes for granted these connections between monitoring and managing the environment. And this implies the continuous production, reproduction, archive, maintenance, dissemination, and use of data. So I think that the tenets that I have just described under this umbrella of the digital environment guide governmental agencies, private corporations, and also academic scientists when they collect data. And they also guide users and consumers of this data. However, I claim, and I will argue, that we must not take for granted this relationship between data and the environment. We must not take for granted the presence of data in our environmental discourses, practices, and policies. And this is what historians or another scholars interested in the social studies of science are for, to investigate how and why we came to that situation. So let me elaborate a bit. So from environmental history, we know that what we understand as nature, as climate, as the environment changes throughout time and throughout history. Here you have some other works, some reference. There are many, many, many works that deal with history of environment. In particular, the notion of environment that interests us today is the idea of environment as both scientific and political entity of global scope. And by global, I mean not only in geographical terms, of course, but also global because all spheres of our society have been colonized by some kind of environmental related thinking. Think of sports, industry, leisure, health, clothing. We can no longer live in this world without taking into consideration some kind of environmental related sensibility. Environmental history is not yet really clear about the how and the why of such development, but it situates it in the second half of the 20th century. For example, the notion of climate, take the notion of climate. Before the 20th century, the concept of climate was not a global thing. Here is how I learned in the 80s and 90s what the climate was. It was an average of a given atmospheric conditions in a given place, often defined as opposed to the concept of weather. How it became global is still a matter of inquiry. Anyway, history tells us that this conception of climate gained important impetus in the 80s and the 90s, a period which many scholars have called the climate regime. And it was in this period that climate ideas consolidated from being the research stuff of a few specialist scientists to become also a matter of international diplomacy capable of shaping political, economic, and cultural landscapes. So this was the same period in which Earth orbiting satellites proliferated and began enabling vast compilations of data about the oceans, the atmosphere, and the land surfaces. Of course, correlation does not necessarily mean causality. Historians, as you, shall avoid simplistic accounts of unique, univoc, and isolated causality for many reasons. For instance, history of the earth sciences has demonstrated here. You cannot see very well, I see. But this article demonstrates that history of the earth sciences has been characterized, at least in the 16th century, by this quest for getting more and more and more and more data. So this big data thing is not new from our days, and using all technologies available, from ships, then balloons, then aircrafts, and then rockets, and then satellites. So no big deal here in getting more data with satellites. And also, we shall avoid this, we should not be disturbed by this focus on the bigness of this big data. Many studies of science have demonstrated that this, how this bigness is part of this techno-heroic narrative to explain and justify science. Here you have some, from a historical perspective, some works that deal with this big data in history. Historians of technology have illustrated how technology influences our perceptions of the environment. I like, one of my favorite ways to frame it is using the concept of environment in technology. So look, another work. Look at this picture, very beautiful, but strange because there is not a single cloud. And this is taken by MODIS. One of the frequencies of MODIS cannot detect water vapor, so clouds are invisible to this frequency. So the choice of the sensor we put inside a satellite, it's a spatial resolution the times it crosses a given region, its materiality conditions what becomes measurable, what visible to our senses, what comes into an existence, what kind of environment do we perceive. This is another example of how satellite data influence the way we describe climate or the environment, and deals with El Niño. As you know, from a scientific point of view, El Niño is today understood as this climate pattern that describes the periodic cooling of water in the Pacific Oceans that produces rains and floods and erosion in coastal regions of South America, while produces droughts in Australia or Indonesia, right? But before the 90s, El Niño was very poorly understood by Western science, and it was often, or it was only understood as a very local phenomenon that impacted economic activity in the South American regions, often embedded with histories of famine and devastation. So the launch of the satellite Topex Poseidon in '92 allowed this global vision of the oceans at global scale, and it produced data of the sea surface temperature that allowed to predict episodes of, or not to predict, but to detect episodes of El Niño in '92 and '98, and to situate the phenomenon into a world map like this one. Historians Sabina Holler and others have demonstrated that with this data, El Niño moved from a marginal position in narratives about climate to being one of the most emblematic objects of climate discourses today. What counts as data also changes over time. And I like very much the example of climate numerical models. So since the 90s, climate scientists have been using numerical simulations outputs as data, as if they with the same epistemic status as observational data. And at the same time, satellite data are not just objects floating out there that can be collected if one has the right tools. Instead, like all forms of data, they are cultural artifacts, historically situated and profoundly marked by the conditions of scientific practices, institutional settings, socio-technical arrangements from which they emerge. I like very much the expression becoming data that precisely emphasizes all these configurations involved in generating, negotiating, making evident, sharing, and consuming the data. So this is the Antarctic ocean hole, first image released in '83. The first hole released in '83. But well, this hole did not simply appear on the screen as such. It took years. It was as the result of careful work of interpretation and intervention on satellite data. It took years for scientists to see a hole over the Antarctica. And it was not, it was the decision of the communication department at NASA not from atmospheric chemists to define that as a whole. So as a form of this institutional propaganda of the American agency, but also because NASA needed to justify to compete with British scientists that had published data about the decrease of the ozone over the Antarctica years before. They needed to justify the usefulness of satellites, right? Why would we need a satellite if we can have the same results with cheaper spectrometers in situ? So the point here is that this is an interesting paper that describes this historical episode. The point is that data do not pre-exist. They do not speak by themselves. They must be produced, circulated, and used. And each of these processes of production, circulation, and use embed historical, organizational, material, ideological conditions, which entails that data can carry various messages, including ambiguous political messages, including conflictual messages sometimes. And here, this is an example that shows how satellite data are implicitly political. Since the mid-2000s, maybe you've heard of that, in the US, several private companies are emerging that claim that they can provide meteorological data faster and cheaper than NASA and NOAA, the federal agency charged with the weather satellite system. So letting the private, they claim to put these tiny satellites, hundreds of them, to collect weather data. Letting the private sector into a field that has so far dominated only by governmental institutions is a political choice. And a political choice that has, of course, organizational, infrastructural, economic, and even moral implications. Imagine that information about a devastating hurricane is only available to those that are able to pay for it, right? My point here is that in this transition from a view where weather data are seen as a public good to a view where they are seen as a commodity to be bought and sold, the system of data production and distribution is key, is at the heart of this transition. And here's an article that describes that. And the value of history of data, or of history of satellite data, or history of environmental satellite data is precisely that it questions this uneven system of data sharing by exploring its origins, its configurations, and its social dynamics. Still another example. Along the 80s, NASA created and promoted a system to distribute environmental satellite data, which I like to describe as a factory because it was a system at the service of a commodity, the data. And it was later adopted by most of the organizations that produce satellite data in the world. And according to the system, you see one of these yearly drafts in the screen. Data was classified or organized following a series of levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, etc. In principle, depending on on the technique that was used to process this data, the types of algorithms, the correction that were applied. I'm sure that those who work with satellite data are familiar with this level 1, level 2, level 3 in this room. But this whole structure, hierarchical, around this system was a structure, a whole hierarchical structure that determined the kind of scientists turned into factory workers that needed at each stage of this production chain. And also who had the privilege to access the data at each stage. So, and therefore, who was legitimate to conduct science and who was left aside of this privilege to conduct science, and how this data was supposed to be used. That is, what was the correct form of making science? What good science was? And therefore, what was left to the margins?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I confirm we can hear you loud and clear.
20 minutes without audio?
No. We have just that, you know, 20 seconds ago, and it was very interesting. So I was kind of
Okay, we are back, and you can see the screen, right?
Yes, we do.
Thanks. So yeah, this boundary work. So this example of these levels of data production was at the time in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s, a very efficient way to establish such boundaries. What kind of science was to be done with satellite data and what kind of science not. Okay, to be sure, data must be classified, of course, in order to be usable. Data must be put into some kind of category always. Classification systems are essential to all working infrastructure. More generally, it is just that once a system is in place, it becomes naturalized as the way things are. And this means that we do not question how our classification systems are constructed. What values or judgments or hierarchies are encoded into them, or why were they thought in this way and not another way in the first place. For instance, this factory system implied a separation between those who produce the data and those who use them, and those who create them in between, and then all those who sell them in the market. And I like to approach this in terms of power relations and inequalities. The social, cultural, political, and economic geography of those few who produce the data, 90% white, well-educated male, middle class, localized in Western capitalist social democracies, this has little to do with the social, cultural, political, and economic geography of the majority of those who use the data, which are spread all over the world. No sé si no sé con permiso. Yes, this example. So who produces data and what for? This matters. And this example, so this is an image of the Earth at night released by NASA in 2012. And this is one of the most merchandised images of all times, I think. So environmental historian Sarah Bridger has illustrated the implications of the dominant view or the dominant narrative that accompany that goes with this image, which emphasizes the problem of light pollution, which is a very important problem, of course. I'm not denying that. Stressing these environmental discourses, industrialized discourses. But that invisibilizes another reading of the same image in terms of poverty light, or light poverty. So this is very important because the way we frame a problem shapes how it is understood and how it is addressed. So she illustrates that NASA decided to exclude all natural light, which was also, this is SWAMI satellite. And so the satellite recorded all kind of light, natural and artificial. But NASA decided to remove auroras, volcanoes, fires, to remove all this kind of light from this image and to leave only artificial light, derived from electricity, mostly. Of course, fires, for instance, are not only natural, are a complex articulation of natural and social aspects. Drought, composition of a forest has something to do, but also cigarette use, agricultural activity, environmental policies have also a say in fire activity. And the irony or the tragedy, she says, is that precisely these not natural aspects, for instance, of environmental policies, are negotiated internationally and very often promoted by Western industrialized countries to be applied to African or rural or global south regions with discourses of protecting the environment. There are discourses that prevent precisely to install or these areas to have electricity because the natural environment must be protected. according to this international legislation. So this image reflects and perpetuates the power relations in place and all the colonial development, even somehow racist narratives regarding the global South. What is at stake at this image at the end is justice and inequality perpetrated by this Western view of what is an environmental problem. So data are never wrong. They are always the product of unequal social relations, very often affected by centuries of history. And this example illustrates that data which are produced by a small group and then scaled up to all users all over the world, but this small group is not representative of the whole world. And yet these data come to exert outsized influence on the ways we think what environment is and what are the environmental problems. And so the way we solve these environmental problems. More, let us focus for a moment in the in-between that I mentioned before, all the processes involved in the maintenance of and reparation of the infrastructures of data production and circulation, from the satellites themselves to the ground antennas, IT security protocols, and also the maintenance of the data over time. I like to approach this in terms of ethics of care. Who takes care of the data? Maintaining data over time requires attention, continuous attention and work. And this is still more imperative in the case of environmental data or climate data, which must be preserved during decades and ideally centuries. So it is crucial to take care of the archive. And yet, tasks related to data curation are invisibilized, very often considered second-order tasks of lower social and epistemic status. And this is not new in the history of science. All these examples, you see how all this work has been invisibilized by science and by history of science all over the centuries. Look at this is already in the illustration time when science, what we understand as science, came into being. Interesting enough, history of computer science has illustrated how all these data analysts or human computers, they were called in their respective times, how these low status second class jobs made very often by women, very often by Black women over centuries, when this task was rebranded as data science and it was institutionalized, became a part of the academic program in the 70s and 80s. And it also became a matter of high status researchers, and commercial value was also envisioned. Then women were pushed out, and we are still inheriting these policies. So one more thing about this data system, or how this data system contributed to perpetuate the status quo of the time it was designed. This factory of data was based on the ideology that scientific data must be open to all those willing to use it. In part, this ideology was supported by the American legislation of the time and economic theory prevailing, neoliberal economic theory prevailing in the 80s and 90s, which resonates very much with the vision of data as a public good mentioned before. Now, one thing is to open data, and another thing is to being able to use it. You need specific equipment, specific training, specific processing systems, and in that, American labs and American systems had a leg on. And also, another way of seeing that, this system of open data promoted by the US in the 80s and 90s was also a way to provide a good image of the US satellite system in a time in which remote sensing satellite systems, American remote sensing satellite systems were accused of spying or of violating national sovereignty, international laws. So it was a way to open to others to show, to show a positive face of the American satellite system. Here I describe all this in this article, this soft power behind this open data factory system. So last example. Environmental history tells us that tropical trees or tropical forests have been the object of conservation policies at least since the 17th century. Here we have a typical representation of such forests in Malaysia. So when using satellite data, one of the several ways to depict tropical forests is in that form. There are various juridical devices that are based in this type of data that enumerate trees in a forest in that way, and that are used to transform the tropical trees into carbon stocks, right? To be inserted in the global market. So we know from history of technology that the social impact of a technology, not this policy mantra that everything has to have a social impact today, not in this sense, in an historical sense. For instance, Spatiales are a technology that has been socially, that has had a social impact over centuries. So this kind of social, I'm talking about this kind of social impact of technology. So this social impact of technology has more to do with intensive and widespread use of a technology, and less with its innovation or design or creation processes. So the essential design of a pencil has not changed over centuries, and yet it is still today one of the, its impact is still enormous today. So the example of this carbon stock reaffirms this idea that users of technology also matter, or users of data in this case also matter, and they are not simply consumers of data, but they transform the data by giving new meanings to them. And not only that, in so doing, data users participate in defining what the environment is in a way that is compatible with their data users. So in short, again, the way in which we frame a problem conditions the type of solutions that we find to it, and the way in which satellite data describe the trees and the climate as a stock of carbon carries with preferential modes of acting upon climate, in this case by monetizing and trading the tropical trees. So all this background allows us to see that satellite data form the nexus of various economic, diplomatic, regulatory, communication, and scientific interests. And I argue that data must be contextualized. Satellite data history is necessary to challenge all these existing dominant simplistic accounts of the environment as a merely technological, or the environment problem as a merely technological problem that can be solved uniquely using technology, which are dangerous because they imply that the obstacles to environmental action are epistemic rather than political. And my job as historian is precisely to get an understanding of how this narrative came into being. So ultimately, I argue that we must not take satellite data for granted as if they are unquestionable, surrounded by this aurea of truth, objectivity, and accuracy, as if they are not subjected to scientific or political debate. They are because they are never wrong, but they must be cooked with care. They are because their production, circulation, and use involve a whole political, economic, juridical, and diplomatic infrastructure, which must be investigated. Data are never neutral. And this does not mean that data are false, they are fake, or useless. It only means that data never are a neutral representation of some sort of essential truth or essential reality. And examining the asymmetries of power in data collection and circulation that lead to inequalities in the data set itself and in its use is the kind of knowledge that history can offer. And this is what I'll be doing during the next 5 years. As Alba said, I've been granted with the CRC strategic grant. And because we all have the intuition that somehow satellites or satellite data contribute to give shape to our way of understanding climate change, as well as to define political and economic options to face it. And we also have the intuition that climate discourses, practices, and policies contribute to give sense and meaning and possibility and opportunity to satellite technology and help perpetuate it. But how exactly it happens is still largely unknown. So with the team, we will investigate this history from these different branches of history that are involved in the production, circulation, and use of data, which are science and technology, economy and finances, law and regulation, communication, and diplomacy. And we want to know how the historical interrelations between technologies, politics, social institutions, power relations, vulnerabilities, cultural norms shaped both satellite data and current existing conceptualizations of climate and their policy implications. And this will allow us to find out how satellite data and our current understanding of climate co-evolved, influenced each other. And this is all. I hope it was not too hard. Thank you.